World IPv6 Day is June 6th, and it's a really exciting time on the internet. Unlike last year, the folks that are participating are going to leave IPv6 connectivity on after IPv6 Day ends. I wanted to go over a few challenges that providers in the IPv6 space are going to have. The first problem I wanted to talk about was a deployment problem using IPv6. So it's really important when carriers deploy IPv6 addresses to their customers that those customers have true connectivity for DNS and for packets throughout their whole network. And the reason for this is that when a PC gets an IPv6 address, it will immediately start choosing that connectivity first. So if it doesn't have complete connectivity to the outside world, you're going to have some timeouts. And the reason for that is that, when it has an IPv6 address, it'll do the name resolution, it'll get an IPv6 destination, and it'll attempt to connect to that remote site. When the connection fails after some amount of time, it will then retry using v4. So your customers will have incredibly slow, difficult performance using the internet if their connectivity is not right. So it's important to make sure that when you hand out a v6 address to any customer, that they have true connectivity. The second thing that you want to be very careful about when you deploy IPv6 as a carrier is your mail server. And this is an area that's not considered very frequently. The reason why is that currently inbound connections coming from IPv4 are checked using DNSBLs and other methods for anti-spam and denial of service attacks. But right now, IPv6 is such a large address space that doing so is almost impossible. Now, if I use those addresses to connect to your mail server as a spammer, I will have an almost unlimited amount of time to attempt to send spam to attack your mail server. In fact, I could use connections at 1,000 per second for 1 billion years and still never run out of unique new addresses to attack your mail server. So as a provider, it's really important not to enable inbound IPv6 connectivity to your mail server. The third thing to consider about IPv6 deployment is the amount of traffic to your DNS servers. The way they're programmed in an IPv6 enabled world is the application asks to translate a name, the operating system looks at the networking and says, oh, I have IPv6 and IPv4 connectivity. The operating system will first make an IPv6 query or a quad A query. And that query will go off to the DNS system, and if it's successful, an address will come back. If it's not, the operating system will say, okay, there's no quad A record, I also have v4 connectivity. So now I'll make an A record query for the same thing. So this is something carriers really need to think about. If your DNS system is running close to capacity, or maybe even 50% capacity at the moment, it's very easy to double the amount of DNS traffic simply by deploying IPv6. The last issue to consider when you do an IPv6 deployment is reverse DNS. Now, reverse DNS is the translation of IP addresses back into names. Currently, in IPv4 world, this is done almost exclusively by static tables. In IPv6 world, that's not the case. It's really a dynamic exchange. Part of a customer's Ethernet address or MAC address is sent to the provider combines that with some addressing information, some networking information they have, and then those two combine together to provide the IPv6 addresses that the customer will use. So that's a real substantial change in terms of reverse DNS. And the reason why is simply that the provider doesn't know in advance what the addresses of all of its customers are. So if you don't know in advance, you can't create a simple table that translates an IP address back into a name. That table can't be static. So you need to make some significant changes to your reverse DNS mappings. And whether that method is based on keying off of when you hand the address out, or pre-computing, or algorithms, or things like that, you just really need to embrace the fact that your reverse DNS infrastructure is going to need some real changes to work in the IPv6 world. We're all very excited about IPv6 Day this year especially. It's really the beginning, the real beginning of the migration of the internet toward IPv6.